Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hambro. I am the Global Head of Thematic and Sector-based investing at BlackRock. And it's a great pleasure to be hosting this panel today with these fabulous and august guests. Today, we're going to be talking through everything with regards to reimagining energy and redefining consumption systems. And thank you all for dialing in. It is clear that to reach net zero, not only do we need to change how we generate the energy we use, but we also need to change the whole production process to think circular and keep the energy and valuable materials we use in the system. The energy transition is going to affect all of us and lead to change, and we need to make sure that we don't create injustice as part of that. And finally, we've seen huge progress announced at COP26, but it is equally clear that transitioning to net zero requires an acceleration in what is being done at the moment. So I'm just going to introduce my guests on the panel today, starting off with Andrew Morlet, who is CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The foundation was established in 2010 with the aim to accelerate the transition to a circular economy, one that is restorative, regenerative by design, and eliminating waste and pollution, and keeping products and materials of high value in use for longer. We've got Rachel McEwen, who's Chief Sustainability Officer for SSE. Rachel is a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission and a member of the Fair Tax Mark Board. And finally, Damilola Ogunbiyi, CEO and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy and the co-chair of the UN Energy as well. Damilola is also Commissioner for the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty and co-chair of the COP26 Energy Transition Council. I know that we all have time constraints today, so what I'd like to do is, if I could, I'd like to start off with Damilola on this panel. So, coming to you, how do you see the energy transition without disadvantaging certain groups from a policymaker perspective?
So first, thank you for having me today. What we've been trying to do here at COP and through the Energy Transition Council is to infuse the understanding that energy access is part of energy transition. So as we talk about decarbonizing everywhere else and reduction in energy, I'm from a continent where you have to time 10x the amount of energy that needs to be had to allow people to live equitable lives and to end energy poverty. We all know we've never really seen a country that didn't have any energy and grew to economic growth. And countries still need industrial growth. We're living in a world today where we still have 759 million people without electricity at all, so they can't log in to watch what we're doing right now, and 2.6 billion that have absolutely no access to clean cooking. So when we talk about the transition, that's also a transition, getting them onto the energy ladder to have efficient energy to reach economic growth is just as important as signing coal to the past and drastically reducing emissions. We can't continue this narrative and forget a billion people as we go together and hand in hand in climate change, because one thing the pandemic has shown us is that we're all together in this. You can't have some countries do it and other countries be left behind.
And Damilola, where have the positives and disappointments been so far with regards to COP26 for you?
Okay, one of the key positives, because I'm a bit of an optimist, is the announcement made between the Rockefeller Foundation and the IKEA Foundation to join the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. So that's including the Bezos Foundation. It's bringing in about 1.5 billion of philanthropic money to raise another 10 billion of funding for this issue, energy access and the clean energy transition. So that's been incredibly positive. Moving forward. Still think there needs to be a lot more announcements on how we are going to finance the transition for developing countries. So where I come from, Nigeria, my president actually said that they were going to reach net zero by 2060. And you can imagine how major that is for such a giant of oil and gas in the African context. However, that transition is going to cost $410 billion above usual spending between now and 2060. So having an understanding of how developing countries are truly going to fund it, I think is not clear yet. There's still a couple of days to go, so we're still optimistic.
So outside of funding, which you obviously mentioned very clearly, what other areas of support do these countries need to help them in the transition? And how can we persuade those countries also to adopt clean energy policies?
I think first it has to be the planning. So one of the key reasons why Nigeria did make that announcement is because the energy transition for my organization, Sustainable Energy for All, we developed the energy transition plan for them, because countries have to understand what it means to electrify their entire economies. So planning is very, very key. Data and evidence is so important. And then finally, putting together the right policy and regulatory framework to allow investors to come, to allow private to come, because this is not all going to come from public sector, and it shouldn't. You want private sector to add the efficiency that you need to make sure your energy.
Damilola, thank you very much. That's great insights there. So if I jump now across back to Andrew, and Andrew, transitioning to a net zero requires a huge across the entire economy. How have you seen the driving forces of this within the concept of being increasingly circular?
Thanks, Evie. I think what's interesting is the focus, and particularly being here at COP this week, the focus is very, very much on the energy transition, and obviously that's crucially important. What also needs to occur, though, is the transformation of the real economy, because in fact, if you look at the analysis, the energy transition will get us around half the way to the 1.5 degree target. The other 45–50% actually is in the way in which we make and use things. It's the real economy. And I think what we're seeing is, at the moment, a number of leading companies that we're working with around the world and governments starting to recognise the importance of the circular economy. But I think the next step is to connect the idea of the circular economy and keeping materials in the economy longer, keeping them productive, eliminating waste and pollution in products we put on the market, and trying to get to a regenerative model whereby when we put products on the market, they actually are nature positive. They're helping us to build nature. That sort of thinking and connecting that to the climate agenda and the achievement of the 1.5 degree target, I think is where we're heading, and that's really where we are right now.
And Andrew, you and I have spoken many times before, and I think one of the things that I've always learnt from you, and I think this often comes from some of the feedback from some of the companies that you work with, is that although the end goal is exactly what you've just described, the journey is going to be filled with enormous opportunities and threats for companies as they transition. And so trying to get companies to understand the value that can be created from being increasingly circular, but also the risks to their businesses from not doing that must be a big challenge for you. Are you seeing significant progress in the kind of greater understanding there? And can you give us some examples on some of the areas where you've seen this being kind of adopted most rapidly?
Yes. Well, first off, I think there is a growing appreciation of the opportunity that this represents. The public are looking for solutions. They're looking for ways of participating and being part of the solution, whether it's climate change or some of the other global challenges. And many of the companies that we're working with recognise this, and they're innovating their product service systems to offer people better choices, really. And there are many examples of this in the companies that we're working with, whether it's in automotive or in furniture or in fast-moving consumer goods, food products, for example. And we're seeing chairmen, CEOs starting to talk about the notion of looking forward to competing on the basis of being nature positive. And this is huge, because that starts to reorient the design question for products, product service systems, the way they think about their ecosystems, their supply chains. They're really starting to think about how to design new product service systems that are both circular economic, eliminating in many instances the need for new raw materials, keeping the materials that they put into their products in the system longer, creating service models that allow them to resell and share these products, reuse them, etc. But also thinking about how they can actually design food, for example, or textiles in a way that promotes regenerative agriculture, which does two things. I mean, at least two things. It really does abate and capture carbon in the soil, build soil, but also promote biodiversity. And the interesting thing here about the circular economy is that it ticks many, many boxes. It's not just a question of better recycling or waste management. It's a system solution that gets you many, many benefits, and it is a new form of competitive space, and it is clearly economically viable and attractive. The challenge is the transition, but this is a type of challenge that many, many businesses are completely used to. You need to transform the business to be able to capture the technology advantage, to capture the changing competitive landscape. So we're really quite encouraged by what we're seeing with many of the companies that we're working with. But I would say, policy is important to create a level playing field and also to enable this transition to occur faster.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think obviously within this subject, it's often easy to think about, as you pointed out, when you're thinking about being circular, it's about consumption of resources and how can you keep those resources in circulation for longer. But also what you've spoken about, most recently, and the foundation has been kind of pushing forward, is not just the resources, but actually keeping the energy that has gone into manufacturing these goods, keeping that within circulation. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and that really goes to the 55-45, the 55% of the 1.5 degree target that we have is through energy efficiency and renewable energy. The other 45% of it is in fact in the way in which we make and use things. It's keeping the invested energy that we put into products in the system longer. So easy examples. If you think of a car, you put the fuel into the car. We need to put renewable fuel in, but think of all of the materials, the metals, the electronics, the plastics, the fibres that go into the physical car itself. That's got a lot of energy that's got it into being a car. We want to keep that car in use as long as possible and fuel it with renewable energy. And you can think about that in terms of clothing. I mean, we make more and more clothing today than we ever have in history. We keep it for shorter than we ever have, and we use it less. So just by using our clothes more, keeping it longer, we keep the embedded energy and all of those materials in the system longer and significantly lower the energy demand of the system going forward. So I think it's really important to think of this other half of the equation, and we need to also avoid the situation where we just electrify a linear economy and actually enable that to actually flow faster. So we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure we capture the energy advantage, but also address many of the other global challenges in the process.
Great, thank you, Andrew. That's a natural segue to bring in Rachel. So Rachel, obviously we need an enormous amount of investment that needs to be put and deployed in order to help us move to net zero. How do you see this progressing in the UK from the power generation side?
Thanks for having me today. And you're absolutely right. It's really commonly understood how important it is to take every last kilogram of carbon out of electricity generation. And it's also true that the power sector has actually done a reasonable job so far and done a fair amount of the heavy lifting in terms of carbon reduction. Certainly here in the UK, that's the case. And the company I work for, SSE, is a reasonably good case in point. So we're an electricity generator, and our direct carbon emissions have fallen by about 70% in the last 10 years. But the truth is, we'd be in an alternative universe if we hadn't heard the very clear message from COP26 that to keep 1.5 degrees alive, then we need to accelerate to net zero, and especially these sort of 9 years that are left in this decade. And if I just take my own narrow market context in the UK, we pretty much know what we need to do to get a net zero electricity system by 2035. So that's the kind of thing that we're aiming for now. So we need about 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, and give you a sense of what that means. It's about 2.5 billion pounds of investment for every gigawatt, and we need another 40 of them. We need 12 gigawatts of onshore wind. We need more zero carbon flexible generation, things like pumped hydro in our wet and rainy Scotland. But we also need to bring unabated gas generation to a close. And that's in UK market. Obviously, coal comes first, and we've pretty much closed most of the coal generation in the UK so far. But we have to bring those things to a close that keeps the lights on. So, of course, this is just a perspective from our corner of the world, but the challenge and the opportunity of this pace and scale is clearly something that every electricity market globally needs to contend with.
Yeah, it's a great point around the investment in terms of the new and renewable sources of actual power generation, but it's not just that element that needs to have the investment as well. It's the grid, and we need to see the grid that was designed for a certain direction of flow. That's going to be a very different pattern in the future. What opportunities do you see in that, and how do you see that area of the market changing? Do you see different levels of businesses plugging themselves in and providing alternative services? What are the roles for groups like your company attached to that change?
So you're absolutely right. There are plenty of opportunities associated with smart electricity grids. And I think one of the key things is that these opportunities aren't just for power companies. There's basically opportunities for many, many people, consumers, intermediary companies, data companies, all sorts. But the core of this is exactly as you described. Our electricity systems, particularly in the developed world, were planned from a kind of top-down approach. So I always describe it as a small number of people in a small room making very big decisions around the allocation of big generation kit. What's changing is this dispersed, distributed nature, not just of electricity generation, but also of electricity demand. So demand is almost becoming a tradable service. So that provides all sorts of opportunities for all sorts of people.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make there, and obviously we've seen, just recently, huge volatility in the power markets in the UK, and obviously we're all aware of, the things that have gone into that. But in terms of thinking about that volatility, where do you think what impact does that have on policymakers when they start to see that kind of thing happening? We've all got price caps that we're exposed to, but the affordability of that should be being kind of there should be a recognition that affordability shouldn't necessarily need to be funded if we can have a less volatile environment and we can have this kind of smoother operational performance. So what are the investment plans that you think that the country needs to make in order to kind of smooth that volatility for all of the consumers?
Okay, there's quite a lot in there. I suppose the most obvious point to begin with is that the higher prices, sort of baseload prices for electricity, are being driven by higher global gas prices, and in our own UK world, higher carbon prices. And that is impacting on the price of power. But over the long term, that obviously makes a greater case for renewables. But in the UK market, because of the penetration of wind power, the difference in power price from windy days to non-windy days is perhaps very striking. So if there was a message from that for investment, then it's probably the fact that the UK does not have sufficient low carbon flexible generation. And also that as we continue to build out renewables, there'll be clearly surplus electricity. So investment opportunities that will enable storage and the use of that surplus are perhaps becoming clearer. But your other point, which is about costs on consumers, and you're dead right. This is a really hugely important. And there's many answers to that question. And the first thing I want to say is it's not very fashionable anymore, but I'm delighted Andrew said it earlier, is that energy efficiency has got to come first. Again, in the UK, they're amongst the least energy efficient homes in the world. We've got a lot of work to do to make them more efficient, but the cheapest kilowatt hour of electricity is the one that you don't consume. But then there's a bigger picture point, which is this question of an all energy system. So as we electrify heating and motoring, then the overall cost burden on households need not be higher. But what we're probably going to need to do is to be very smart from a regulatory perspective to make sure that there are consumer protections, especially for the most vulnerable that maybe don't get the benefits of, for example, the reduction in consumption or the reduction in costs associated with not buying petrol and using your electricity to fill your car, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, this whole concept of a just transition, without disadvantaging certain groups, sharing the burdens and benefits of the transition across the population is going to be an essential part of that. What more can the government do to make that position clearer?
So there's plenty that government should do. So from a company perspective, but also Scotland as well. Scotland's been leading the way. Got a Just Transition Commission and a Just Transition Minister. We have put a lot of thought into this. I think the first thing to say is that when you think about a just transition, you need to think about it in a very broad sense. And your point about sharing the burdens and benefits is exactly right. There's lots of wonderful things associated with climate action, things like clean air in our neighbourhoods because we don't have internal combustion engines. But there's also bad things, so cost of lost livelihoods or the costs on products and services. Now, in order to tackle that, though, if you think it's a really big, broad problem, in order to tackle that, you're going to have a really big, broad response. And what you need is to have what's called a social dialogue or a coalition between government, industry, trade unions, NGOs, and many others. And that's a hard thing to achieve. But I don't think it's impossible. I just want to give you a little example quite quickly. So we've been concerned about the worker transition. In the north of Scotland, you've got North Sea oil and gas, and we've also got a burgeoning offshore wind industry at the same time. And we did some research looking at our employees, how many had transitioned from offshore oil and gas into the company. Turns out 1 in 5 of our workforce have come from formerly high carbon industries. And they've chosen to do that. So there's been a pull into the green industries. And what we learned from that, and I suppose before we'd done the research, I wasn't convinced that we could pull off a sort of seamless transition for the workforce. But actually, we're kind of going with the flow here, and it isn't beyond the wit of us all to put together, rules around energy apprenticeship programs and all sorts that mean it will be seamless for people to move from sector to sector within the industry.
Yeah, it's a great point, that, and also an excellent example. I just want to bring Andrew back in quickly before we kind of wrap up. Andrew, you've obviously been on the ground at COP26. What are your kind of key takeaways that you've been able to pick up that you could share with the audience?
I think there's some very interesting conversations going on. First off, it's actually quite hard to get perspective on COP because it's so big and it's so spread out. But my personal experience from the meetings I've attended, there's been a lot of really very encouraging signals, and clearly there is a lot of things mobilising in the right direction. The finance discussions that we participated in yesterday in Finance Day, it was really encouraging to hear Philip Hillebrand and others talking about how capital is starting to look for the ways of reallocating capital, looking at signals measurement that allows them to do that. The money's available, we just need to orient into the right places. I think that was encouraging. And I think it's also encouraging to see the discussion about nature positive and the connection of other ideas, whether it's just transition, biodiversity, etc., starting to rise up. I think there's a lot more opportunity for that to happen. We're not yet hearing the real economy story that I talked about before, that the notion of retaining the energy in the system in the way that we need to lower the demand. But overall, I think that there's certainly things moving. We need to do much more, clearly.
Andrew, Rachel, and I know that Damilola isn't with us anymore, but thank you both very much for your time. And I think it's clear that to reach net zero, not only do we need to change how we generate the energy we use, we also need to scale the circular economy systems and supply chains, which keep that energy and those valuable materials within the system. The energy transition is going to affect all of us and lead to change. And we need to make sure that we don't create injustice as part of that change. And we take everyone with us in the transition to avoid disadvantaging groups. The impact on people and the planet is going to be enormous. And finally, I just think that we've seen further progress with what's been announced at COP, but it is equally clear that transitioning to a net zero requires an acceleration, a very rapid acceleration from what is being done at the moment. Thank you all for your time today.